everyone who's joined us. My name is Anthony Ong, and welcome to our seminar series, which is sponsored by the Cornell Center for Integrative Developmental Science. And I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker of this semester, Dr. Eranda Jayawickreme. Eranda is the Harold Tribble Professor of Psychology at Wake Forest University, where he also is Senior Research Fellow at the Program for Leadership and Character. He received his PhD in social and personality psychology at the University of Pennsylvania in 2010, and he has since gone on to embark on research in a number of very interesting areas, including honesty, intellectual humility, wisdom, and psychological growth, which is the topic of his talk today. Eranda has been recognized for with a number of awards and grants, including a Rising Star Award from the Association for Psychological Science and from the John Templeton Foundation. But perhaps most impressive is his recent appearance on the podcast Hidden Brain, which I very much enjoyed. So I'm really looking forward to his talk. I'm also I was kidding around with him on Twitter today, but I'm actually eager to hear what he has against the iconic genius that is Kelly Clarkson. I'm of course referring to the very optimistic message in her song, "What Doesn't Kill You Makes You Stronger." So with that, if you're ready, Eranda, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Anthony, and thank you also for the invitation. Good afternoon to all of you, and I'm happy to be here to spend some time talking to you about one of my research programs. So as Anthony mentioned, I would say I'm a personality psychologist, and I have maybe three main lines of research. So I do research on understanding character traits from a personality perspective. So I have like a long-standing research program looking at both moral and intellectual character traits. I have a lot of research on personality theory, so understanding personality from a dynamic perspective. And that's research I've done in collaboration with one of my colleagues, Will Fleeson, here at Wake Forest. And then there's my work on post-traumatic growth, which I would say is probably my main line of research, and one that I've done a fair bit of work over the last 12 to 14 years. And for those of you who had the opportunity to listen to my appearance in Hidden Brain, you know that part of the motivation I had for getting into post-traumatic growth research was my childhood in Sri Lanka, right? So I grew up in Sri Lanka for the most part. So my parents are both Sri Lankan. They're from different ethnicities and different religious backgrounds. They met in London in the mid-1970s, got married, and shortly after I was born, they moved back to Sri Lanka. So most of my childhood was spent in Colombo, which is in the southeast corner of the island. You can see that's where the red dot is, and then in Kandy, which is in the center of the island, and that's where my father's family comes from. Now, historically, Sri Lanka has gone through multiple periods of political instability. There was a long-running civil war that lasted from 1983 to 2009. There was also there were two insurrections that occurred in the island in 1971 and 1989, where a Marxist group tried to overthrow the country's government. And in growing up in the context of both the civil war as well as the insurrection, which the second one occurred when I was 9 years old, as I was, getting older, as I was preparing to go to university, I was struck by how many people, not all people, who had gone through all types of really, really non-normative, really terrible experiences, somehow managed to keep on functioning, right? So I'm not saying they flourished. I'm not saying that they somehow, became better version of themselves. But there was a type of resilience that I could see in many people. And as part of my initial work in Sri Lanka, which was the basis for my dissertation research, I examined what were the characteristics of resilience among Sri Lankan Tamil survivors of the Civil War. And this is research that involved data collection from around 2006 to 2009, right? So it was in the last years of the Civil War. And what I found was people would characterize resilient people who are resilient as people who had good status in the community, people who were able to successfully fulfill their family responsibilities, and these responsibilities are usually couched in terms of basic needs, and people who had a strong religious faith. So as I was, finalizing my dissertation project, and I should mention for those of you who are graduate students, I subsequently collected, I think, 3 more rounds of data and finally published the last chapter of my dissertation that related to this work last year. So hopefully that'll be a motivational factor for some of you. But as I was doing this research, presenting on this research, people were coming up and talking to me about how I should look at the research on post-traumatic growth, right? Or the idea that, somehow people can find meaning and insight in the experience that they've gone through. Now, in reading about this idea, right, of how people can make sense and move on from adversity and meaning, it turns out that there is a very, very deep literature in multiple academic disciplines about this question. So, for example, these are 3 very different books about religion. David DeSteno is a psychology professor. David Walper, who's a rabbi who gained some level of fame through his work working with survivors in 9/11, and John Gray, who's a prominent public intellectual in the UK who identifies very strongly as non-religious. And they've all written books about the function of religion. And what's really interesting is that despite the fact they come from different perspectives, they all argue that fundamentally religion is not about finding a rule book for how to live your life or being told, okay, this is how you should live your day-to-day existence. The role of religion is to help explain the unexplainable, right? So the reason why many people are drawn to religion is to the experience of severe adversity or trauma or events that they can't quite comprehend. Now, in different religious traditions, there is a explicit grappling with this question of why there is suffering in the world, right? So for those of you who are familiar with Christian theology, there's this whole area of research, this whole area of study called theodicy, which focuses on why would a just God allow evil in the world. So there's this a very famous philosopher, Eleanor Stump, who's written an extensive book arguing that the reason why there's suffering in the world is to teach us that we are all fragile, interdependent beings, right? That we should be mindful of the fact that we need each other, that we're going to suffer, that we need to have empathy towards other people. So in this account, there's a learning role, right, for experiencing adversity. And in the Buddhist tradition, the idea is that acknowledging that there's suffering in the world opens you up to the possibility of developing different character strengths. So in the Mahayana tradition, there's this discussion of the different, I think the 6 or the 7 wisdoms that you can gain once you acknowledge that in a fundamental sense, life is about suffering. So there's this emphasis on character development. Now, Laurie Paul, who is a philosopher at Yale, wrote this really interesting book a few years ago called on the transformative experience. And she talks about how different types of life events can change us in meaningful ways by either giving us information that we didn't know before. So a simple example would be the experience of trying a new fruit, like a durian fruit, right, that you had never eaten before. And it also can change your personality. So it changes your values. It shifts what you understand is important in life, right? So for example, the experience of having kids is an example of how an experience can shift your values. Now, there has been a lot of recent work in contemporary philosophy targeting suffering or trauma and the impact of those types of events on the individual. One recent exception is a book by Michael Brady, who's a philosopher at the University of Glasgow, who talks about how the experience of suffering is necessary for the development of certain strengths, such as humility and compassion. And here he entertains the idea that for the development of certain types of virtue, suffering may be necessary, right? Which I think is an interesting and provocative thesis. Now, more recently, there's a book that came out a few months ago by one of my favorite musicians, Nick Cave. He's an Australian musician. He's famous for his work with his band, The Bad Seeds. He also went through the experience of losing 2 of his children in recent years. And in this book, Faith, Hope, and Carnage, he talks about how, in ways very similar to how Laurie Paul talks about transformative experiences, how going through that experience of loss and bereavement has led to his opening up of his understanding of the world, as well as the development of certain character traits, such as compassion and humility. So in many areas outside psychology, there is this sort of deep long-standing tradition of discussing what is the role and purpose of adversity and suffering. Now, when you turn to psychology, you do see a different picture. And this is what I realized in my early years of looking through the post-traumatic growth literature. The idea that that adversity can have benefits is something that's spoken about pretty frequently in the media, right? So this is an article from Vox.com from 8 years ago. It's an article about how people can deal with grief. One of the lessons discussed in this article is the possibility that you can learn, you can grow as a person going through the experience of grief and going through the experience of tragedy. In the last 10 years or so, there have been multiple articles written about the idea that trauma can have a positive impact. So this is an article written by the journalist Jim Rendon, discussing research on the benefits people report in the wake of adversity. He subsequently wrote a book on post-traumatic growth, and I'd be happy to talk to you about my experience being interviewed by him. But I think it's very interesting in a number of ways that I think will become clear over the course of the talk. Now, the quote, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." So depending on your cultural touchstone, you'll recognize this as a quote from either Kelly Clarkson, Kanye West, or Friedrich Nietzsche, right? But this has become a meme in the last few years. And especially, right, in popular culture. So for example, superhero movies, right, where the protagonist goes through something terrible or some life tragedy, and subsequently, maybe as a direct result of going through that tragedy, develop superhuman powers, right? So this is idea that's really compelling. I particularly like this Futurama tweak on it, right? Although I might be dating myself by quoting Futurama. So the idea of growth being the result of growth being possible in the wake of adversity is one that seems very appealing. And also, when you look in the psychology literature, it becomes clear that this is something that is somewhat, to some extent, both taken for granted and understood in a very simple, arguably simplistic manner, right? That when something bad happens, it can be challenging, but you can end up a better person. So in my talk today, I want to focus on 4 lessons. One is that I think as psychologists, we need to move beyond simplistic understandings of what it means to grow from adversity. I'm going to make the case that, especially in the wake of the open science movement and the credibility revolution, I will make the argument that current research in post-traumatic growth lacks credibility. I'll then present a personality perspective on post-traumatic growth and make the case that even though people can change in meaningful ways from adversity, it is likely not as ubiquitous as we think it is, definitely not in the short term. And finally, I'll close with some observations of future research, but includes the idea that we need to get theoretically more sophisticated if they're going to do meaningful and functionally useful research on whether people can experience real benefits from adversity. Okay, so let's start with the first lesson. Now, research on post-traumatic growth really took off in the early to mid 1990s. And what's really interesting is that in around 1995 or 1996, you had multiple labs doing research and publishing papers on this idea that people can experience benefits in the wake of adversity. So in 1995, you had work by Stephen Joseph, who's now at the University of Nottingham, on the potential benefits of adversity and how adversity can lead to positive changes in your outlook on life. Crystal Park at the University of Connecticut published a paper on stress-related growth. Pat Frazier published a paper on perceived benefits among survivors of physical violence. But the conceptualization that's probably gotten the most traction is that provided by Rich Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, who published a paper assessing post-traumatic growth using a measure called the Post-Traumatic Growth Inventory in 1996. And they conceptualized post-traumatic growth in terms of positive psychological changes experienced as a result of the struggle with highly challenging life circumstances. So I will note here that as a personality psychologist, I would read this definition and say, okay, this sounds like a definition involving personality change, right? The idea that there's something about you that changes as the result of struggling with highly challenging life circumstances. Now, one thing to keep in mind when thinking about the benefits that people report in the wake of adversity, right, is that especially in the United States, we tend to talk about adversity in a way that highlights how we can move on successfully, right? Or how adversity can lead to something positive in its wake. And this narrative has been termed the redemption narrative. And this is pioneering work that was done by Dan McAdams in the mid-1990s. So he argues that the redemption narrative is a particularly strong narrative in the United States. And he talks about how in different domains of public life or in different domains of research, you see how the redemption narrative shows up as a convenient and easy framing, right? So the idea of atonement in religion, the idea of emancipation in American history, the notion of upward mobility, the notion of recovery, the idea of enlightenment, right? That we were like we were ignorant in the past, but now we are we are more knowledgeable now. And even when you think about development, right? The assumption that as we go through life, we're supposed to change and grow as individuals. Now, there is potentially a lot of value in seeing your life in these terms, right? You go through life, the opportunities, the challenges, the setbacks, and you can maybe learn and grow from those setbacks. And I want to pause and reference this paper that I think just came out yesterday. It was just posted on PsychArchive yesterday by Benjamin Rogers and colleagues. This is a paper that came out of Kurt Gray's lab. And they published it multi-study paper in JPSP showing that thinking about your life in terms of a hero's journey where you see yourself as the author of your own life, you are making decisions to change your life, you're going on quests to fulfill important life goals, you have friends and families who support you, there are challenges that challenge your sense of self, but then you have a think and you overcome it, you become a different person, and then you as a result of these activities, you leave something meaningful in the wake, right, of your life. So the idea is that thinking about your life that way seems to meaningfully increase people's well-being, specifically their sense of psychological well-being or their sense of meaning and purpose. Now, having acknowledged the fact that these types of narratives can be helpful, especially for those of us who live in the United States and who see ourselves as culturally American, it's also worth knowing that this narrative can end up framing how we talk about our life experiences, right? So Kate McLean and more inside have argued that the redemption narrative, or this idea that we can grow from adversity, functions as a way in which we talk about our experience of trauma. So in other words, if you were to ask me about my experience of trauma adversity in my life, the expectation is that I should respond in a way that contextualizes my own experience in terms of redemption of growth. And this can lead to people being cagey or unwilling to talk about their true experience. And I want to discuss an example that was first proposed by Simon Vizier many years ago. So imagine that you're going to a brunch and you're just gone through a breakup and you're feeling really down. And your friends are trying to cheer you up by saying things like, oh, there are plenty more fish in the sea, you have more me time, you have more time to spend with us, don't worry, you can learn something from this. And imagine your response was, no, this sucks, I'm not going to learn anything from it, this is the worst thing that happened, everything's just horrible. Now, you may not say, if you're tactful, you may not say anything to your friend, but you might think to yourself, well, this person doesn't have the right attitude, right? This person doesn't seem to be what I'll call, thinking the right way about how to move on, maybe something wrong. So I think one insight from Simin's example is that in many ways, when we talk about our own experience with other people, we may feel that we have to talk about it a certain way because of norms that govern our interpersonal interactions. When I was a first-year student in college, and I just arrived in the US, people would stop me on the street. They were very friendly to ask me how I was doing. And I would say, I'm doing great. I had a long day yesterday. I had to go to bed at 2 in the morning, but I was able to wake up and get to my first class. And now I think I'm going to have a good afternoon, right? And after a year of doing this, I realized that when people are asking me how I was doing, they just wanted me to say, I'm fine. How are you, right? Now, that's not to say they weren't interested in my welfare, they didn't care about whether I was struggling. But when people ask you how you're doing, there's a certain norm and a certain expectation about how you should respond. And I think this is important to keep in mind, especially given the prevalence of the redemption narrative in the US, because this makes post-traumatic growth a particularly challenging topic to study. Because it means that when people tell us about their experience, we can't necessarily take their responses as face value. So with that lesson in mind, let's move on to the second lesson I want to discuss. And this has to do with the quality of research on post-traumatic growth. Now, I mentioned that the line of research that's gotten the most traction over the last 30 years or so is the work by Tedeschi and Calhoun. And they typically use a measure called the post-traumatic growth inventory, which is the most widely used measure of post-traumatic growth. And I want to make the argument here that that measure of post-traumatic growth actually measures something distinct from what theoretical definitions of post-traumatic growth are saying they should defining the construct as. If you look at the measure of post-traumatic growth, the measure looks at 5 domains of growth: greater life appreciation, the perception you have greater possibilities in your life, new possibilities have opened up, a sense of personal strength in the wake of going through adversity, a heightened sense of religiosity, of spirituality, and an improved appreciation for your relationships. And these are just examples of questions from each of those domains. Participants are typically asked to respond how much they think they will change as a result of going through a life event. Now, I will say that given that today's skincare who are clinicians, this sounds like a very face-valid way to ask about growth, right? I could imagine if you were a clinician talking to a client, you would probably ask them these types of questions. Like, do you think you become stronger because of the adverse life experience? So I will say that this is a very face-valid measure. But once you start thinking about, okay, what are we expecting people to do here? It becomes clear that this measure is in fact, a relatively strange measure. It's an odd metacognitive measure that if you expect people to answer accurately, involves them thinking, okay, how am I doing now? How was I doing before the trauma? Okay, was I doing better or worse than the trauma? Okay, if I was doing better than before the trauma, how much have I changed? So you quantify that in your head. And then you have to think, okay, how much have I changed because of the traumatic event? So there are at least 2 issues with this type of approach. One is that people are not very good at remembering their past selves. We have all types of motivations to think that our present self is better than the past self. So we have a tendency to derogate the past self. And there have been multiple lines of research over the last 30 years that have shown this. So we're not particularly good at estimating how much we've changed. But in addition, this scale assumes that we can accurately identify the cause of that change. And we know from work by Tim Wilson that we don't always know why we have changed, right? We don't always have access to the processes that lead to us changing. So I could tell you a story about how going through a traumatic event impacted me. And that story might be worth evaluating in its own terms. But if I'm a scientist, I'm trying to understand whether going through adversity can change you as a person, asking people whether they thought the trauma changed them as a person is probably not the best way of doing it. So how do we know if these measures have value? So the number of different approaches you can take. And in my research, I've employed a number of methods from personality research to examine whether these measures have validity. One approach is to look at whether people's own self-reports of growth are corroborated by close others. So for example, if I tell you that I've grown following a traumatic event, and my wife and my brother and my other family members agree with me, that should increase our confidence in in my own self-report. So in one study that we published a few years ago, we looked at people's own self-reports of positive change, as indicated by post-traumatic growth, and negative change, where we used a measure of post-traumatic depreciation that used that assess the same domains of post-traumatic growth. And what we found was that when it came to post-traumatic growth, we didn't see strong evidence of corroboration. As you can see, the correlation was very moderate and not significant at a 0.05 level. We were able to look at inter-informant agreements. So when you have multiple informants reporting on your own personality, you can see whether the informants agree with each other. So that's a stronger test of whether you can be confident in someone's self-report. We didn't see evidence for post-traumatic growth, for inter-informant agreement. Conversely, as you can see, we saw some evidence for corroboration for negative change. And this is consistent with personality research looking at self-other agreement traits like neuroticism, right? Where close others tend to be able to successfully or accurately corroborate people's self-reports of negative affectivity. Now, we did a similar study where we had pairs of survivors of the Sri Lankan Civil War reported on their own post-traumatic growth and post-traumatic depreciation and other people's post-traumatic their partner also report on their own post-traumatic growth and post-traumatic depreciation and their partners. So the fact that we got these partner ratings allowed us to run these cool sort of interdependent path analyses. It allows us to look at both assumed similarity and actual similarity. But for now, I want you to pay attention to the correlation at the center of each of these models. So it turns out that the correlation between self-reports and informal reports were moderate, around 0.2. And interestingly, in this sample, the correlation for post-traumatic agreement for post-traumatic depreciation was also moderate, so around 0.2. Now, one reason why you might not see high levels of self-other agreement for a trait like for an individual difference like post-traumatic growth is that post-traumatic growth is a socially desirable construct, right? So in general, we tend to rate ourselves highly on socially desirable constructs. So one way you can get around that is to look at whether people agree on the profile of your traits. So in other words, the relative standing of different domains of post-traumatic growth in relation to each other, right? So for example, I might say that I changed the most on religiosity, the domain I changed the next on was appreciation of life, and so on and so forth. So what you do is that you correlate the shape of the profile with the shape of the profile that your informant provides on you, right? So in other words, does my informant also say that my number one trait was religiosity and my number two trait was appreciation of life? So this accounts for the fact that my informant and I might have very different absolute scores, right, on each of these domains. So what's interesting is that in the US, there is some evidence of profile similarity. So for self-informant and for inter-informant agreement, there is evidence that the targets and informants do agree on the structure of people's trait profiles of change. Now, one reason why informants might provide scores on growth and depreciation is because they might have beliefs about how much the average person grows or depreciates in the wake of adversity. So what we did is we controlled for the average level of growth and in depreciation. So these are the distinctive correlations. And interestingly, we found evidence for self-other agreement, at least we found evidence of self-other agreement, although we didn't find evidence for inter-informant agreement, which is a much more stringent test of agreement. So interestingly, when you look at profile similarity, there's some evidence that when people report these domains of change, there's something about those reports that have some basis in validity, right? Now I should note we ran the same analyses in the Sri Lankan sample, and we did not find evidence of post-traumatic growth, of profile agreement on post-traumatic growth or post-traumatic depreciation. Now, another study that we did to examine the validity of these measures is that we compared people's self-reports on the post-traumatic growth inventory with manifestations of these domains in their daily life. So we created an experience sampling measure, or state measure, that tapped into thoughts, feelings, and behaviors associated with these different domains of growth. We tracked the whole Wake Forest student body over the course of an academic year. And whenever a student reported a major negative or traumatic life event, we invited them to take part in this ESM study. We didn't find a significant relationship between people's aggregated manifestations of post-traumatic growth relevant thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and the scores in the post-traumatic growth inventory, and 4 of the 5 domains of post-traumatic growth. What was interesting is that we did find a significant relationship with spirituality. And I should say here that in some of my work and work that other people like Patricia has done, it seems that people's reports of spirituality tend to be substantially more accurate than the reports of other domains. And I'd be interested to hear from the audience in the Q&A why they think that might be. Like what is special about spirituality such that people are able to give accurate reports, especially when you compare it to these other measures. Now, one argument you can make if you're a post-traumatic growth researcher is that, well, fine, these measures are only poorly related or weakly related to sort of, people's behavior in daily life, or they only weakly track, if at all, other people's perceptions of their growth. But as long as these beliefs have value, right? As long as these beliefs are functionally useful in people's daily life, it's worth promoting them, right? So the argument here is that there might be something about believing you're changed that ends up leading to a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Where that belief about change leads to actual change, right? It also might be that believing in change may lead to mental health benefits, right? In other words, believing that your change could serve a positive coping function. Now, unfortunately, multiple studies, especially multiple longitudinal studies, have looked at the prospective relationship between perceived growth and subsequent change in mental health symptoms, have found that post-traumatic growth tends to predict poorer functioning over time. So this is a study that was published by Engelhardt and colleagues. They tracked a large army sample that had been deployed to Iraq. And they found that increased perceptions of post-traumatic growth, higher levels of post-traumatic growth were associated with subsequent increases in mental health problems. Now, we were interested in this question of whether post-traumatic growth understood as perceived change had this self-fulfilling effect, right? Whether if you believe you've grown, does it lead to subsequent changes in domains of growth? So we ran a multi-wave experience sampling study. It was a 3-wave experience sampling study. And what we did is that we looked at the prospective relationship between reports of perceived growth and changes in trait or current standing assessment of those domains. We also looked at the relationship between perceptions of growth and aggregated assessments of people's state reports of post-traumatic growth, relevant thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And what we found for both the, different domains and across all domains of current standing post-traumatic growth, and also looking at aggregated state assessments, we did not find that levels of perceived growth predicted subsequent changes in people's trait or manifested post-traumatic growth. And we ran random intercept cross-like panel models for both of these sets of data. Okay, so this raises the question of what perceived growth is actually measuring, right? So in line with our findings for the profile findings for our US sample, we have to entertain the possibility that to some extent, some of the variance in people's scores is explained by actual growth, right? So to some extent, people's perceptions of change may be tracking actual growth. It's also possible, going back to my first point, that these assessments might be tracking cultural scripts or expectations of how we're supposed to talk about trauma. Now, it's possible that maybe these assessments of perceived growth might be imperfectly capturing how we shift our identity, right? So in the narrative identity literature, there's a discussion about how, our sense of self is always ebbing and flowing in the context of our, our life circumstances, our social roles, our responsibilities. So maybe as we adapt our sense of identity in the wake of various types of life events, perceived growth measures are capturing that shift. One thing I think is happening is that many of these measures are functioning as a type of coping, as measures of coping. Because if you look at the coping literature, there is a coping construct called benefit finding, right? Where you try to lessen the impact of a trauma and you try to gain some control of the trauma by looking at the silver lining, right? By saying, this is not all bad because this didn't happen and this didn't happen, that's positive. So one thing I think might have happened is that a lot of the early research in post-traumatic growth, like Chris King-Calhoun, simply repurposed measures of secondary control or benefit finding and called those measures of post-traumatic growth. And what we're finding is that, especially in the immediate aftermath of adversity, the perceived growth understood as a coping strategy doesn't seem to be a particularly useful or helpful coping strategy. I'll give you 2 recent examples. Work looking at how COVID impacted the mental health of healthcare professionals in Canada suggests that people believe they've grown in the wake of experiencing COVID-related challenges, tend to have poor mental health and tend to struggle. This also raises a question of what, by distinguishing between post-traumatic growth and benefit finding or secondary control, are we committing the jungle fallacy, where if you look at the content of these measures, they're pretty much assessing very similar constructs. So I think one thing to keep in mind here is that I think it's not obvious to me what purpose the variable perceived growth is serving. Like, what variance is it systematically capturing? What theory is it providing support for? So that's something I think that we as researchers who are interested in post-traumatic growth need to reckon with. Okay, I know that I have a limited amount of time, so I'm going to move relatively quickly through the remainder of my talk. I want to say in the 3rd section of my talk that if you decide to examine post-traumatic growth the way it's being conceptualized, which is as a form of personality change, we need to think more critically and systematically about what type of events would foster growth, for what types of personality traits, what are the processes involved, and I think importantly, what type of timeline would we expect? So, I had the opportunity to work with Nick Restrade and Cornelia Frus, who are, really wonderful personality researchers. We came up with almost, I wouldn't say a theoretical model, but more like a framework for trying to understand how post-traumatic growth can happen. So we talk about the resources people have, we talk about the nature of the traumatic event, we talk about the potential processes, and then we talk about how growth could occur at different levels, right? To borrow Dan McAdams' what we call distinction, we talk about the extent to which growth may occur at the trait level, at the level of goals or characteristic adaptations, and the level of one's narrative identity. And we also talk about how it's both important to distinguish post-traumatic growth from normative change, right? So if we want to make the claim that something distinctive can happen to our personalities in wake of trauma, you have to show that it exceeds normative change. It's also true that we need to be clear about what type of growth we're expecting, right? So, Brent Roberts makes this nice distinction between, tonic growth and phasic growth, right? So the idea that you can experience short-term changes, but maybe over time, because of your personality, you recede back to your normal personality. You can also talk about how maybe over time, maybe because you've gone through a life event and that life event led to changes in life circumstances, that change gets scaffolded such that over time, that change increases and becomes stable. And we don't really have a clear sense of, okay, what type of growth constitutes growth? For me, both types of change are interesting, right? So the short-term change that gradually recedes over time, the change that's more gradual, but then becomes more stable over time. We don't really have clear theoretical frameworks for thinking about what to expect. And that's something I think we need greater conceptual work on. Now, going back to discussion of potential processes that might be at work when people change in the wake of adversity. Some of you might know that, in my work on personality theory, I've discussed how one way in which we can think about traits is in terms of a manifestation or distribution of behaviors or states. And to the extent to which the experience of adversity can shift those states, right? Or in other words, change our behaviors in the short term. To the extent to which those changes become stable over time, those changes can lead to enduring personality change, right? So I'm not going to go into too much detail with this in this because of time constraints, but in some of my theoretical work, especially with Bill Fleeson, we talk about how to the extent to which events can lead to shifts both in the goals that you have and also the strength of the links between both the event and your own motives and goals, and also between your goals and your behavior. Changes can lead over time to shifts in your dispositional behavior. And I know I'm rushing through this, but I'm happy to go through this in great detail. But what we did is that we ran a year-long study, and this is modeled on some other intensive assessments, where we asked people every week to tell us about whether they experienced a major life event in the last week. We assessed traumatic events. We also assessed positive life events, which I'll talk about briefly later. We asked them whether we had them rate the overall well-being, and we included assessments of post-traumatic growth. We also asked them about social events that experience. So we asked them about whether they experienced one or more of 6 positive or negative social events. And we also had them rate the affective quality of those events. So first, I'll present results about whether we observed event-related changes in manifestations of post-traumatic growth as a result of going through specific traumatic events, as well as whether they changed as a result of going through multiple events across the period of 1 year. What we found was that on average, we didn't see any immediate increase in post-traumatic growth, either in the wake of going through the first negative event that people reported, or when you look across all the events they experienced in the study timeframe. Now, we used a 5-item PTG measure. Each item corresponded to one domain of post-traumatic growth. We did some exploratory item level analyses for both changes in the wake of the first experienced traumatic event, as well as changes across all the traumatic events experienced. Across those analyses, the one find that came out was a depreciation or decreased feeling of personal strength, which, if you think about it, makes sense, right? That in the immediate aftermath of going through a stressful life event, your immediate response would be to feel like, can I cope with this? Can I manage with this? We also ran some additional analyses. But one point I want to make before I get to a secondary analysis is to note that one lesson from this study, which I think is important, is that at least in the short term, most people don't report increases in post-traumatic growth. And some of you might think, well, this is obvious because developmentally it'll take time. But I should mention that in many cross-sectional studies of post-traumatic growth, the general finding is that people tend to report post-traumatic growth in the immediate aftermath of adversity, right? I mentioned this study earlier. There are multiple other studies that argue that people report post-traumatic growth understood as perceived change in the immediate aftermath of adversity, which means that this finding is worth acknowledging. Now, we also ran two other sets of analyses. We were interested in whether experience in major life events have the effect on personality by shifting your experience of daily life, right? So if your personality changes because of shifts in your behavior or shifts in how you experience the environment, then that means that one way in which major life events can impact your personality is by shifting how you experience subsequent everyday social events. We also examined whether experiencing major life events leads to changes in your daily social events, but also whether to explore the reverse relationship, whether there's something about shifts in your experience of well-being or ill-being, whether that then subsequently leads to changes in your experience of social events, right? So we were examining this question from a dynamic perspective. Now, the reason why we did this is because one way in which major life events can impact our personality is through changing our situations, changing our experience of everyday social events. Now, I should note here that major life events could change your experience of subsequent events in one of two ways, right? It could be that going through a major negative event can sort of increase the salience of a subsequent positive event, right? Because you're realizing that small things in life are important, right? So for example, if you have a stressful meeting and you're leaving your office and you see a flower, right? Maybe you might appreciate the flower more because the contrast of seeing that positive event with the experience you just had increases your experience of that flower. It could also be that going through a really negative life event could lead to subsequent events being seen more negatively, right? So this is the endowment effect. So because I've gone through some stressful event, everyday events now just weigh down on me more. We found some evidence for the contrast effect. So if people, here we looked at positive events people have gone through, and we found that when people have gone through positive social events, it makes them less willing, like they savor subsequent everyday positive events to a lesser degree. If people go through negative events, that also what I call impacts the relationship with the subsequent experience of positive social events. Now, surprisingly, we also found that experiencing major negative life events subsequently strengthened the relationship between experiencing negative social events and how you felt about that event. Finally, we found that given past research suggesting that we tend to react more strongly to negative events compared to positive events, and given that there might be selection effects going on, given such that people who are higher in negative affectivity are more likely to subsequently select into more negative social events. We also examined those relationships. We did find, and this is consistent with past research looking at the effect of neuroticism on the experience of stress, that people experience a negative life event experience a discontinuity in the trajectory of negative daily social events. In other words, they started experiencing a larger number of negative daily social events. We also found that the extent to which people experience high levels of ill-being in 1 week, that predicted a subsequent increase in daily negative social events. Okay, so those sets of analysis presents one, I think, in my view, much more methodologically rigorous way of thinking about how major negative life events and traumas interact with our experience of daily life and our well-being and our personality to produce change. So since I'm running out of time, I want to sort of wrap up with my final point, which is that post-traumatic growth is a really compelling research question, right? The one reason why there's so much interest in it is that people find it intuitively important and interesting. But in light of the open science revolution and the credibility revolution, this is something Simin Nazir has written a lot about, it sounds like a compelling research question that needs better and more credible research. So as I mentioned earlier, one outstanding question is we've collected so much research, so much data on perceived growth. What is this construct reflecting? An interesting question of that personality researchers need to consider is, what does it mean for someone's personality to change? Now, intuitively, you might think that, well, someone's personality changes, you'd expect their traits to change because, you know, they become more giving, more compassionate, and that would lead to changes in the goals that they care about, so they'll care more about compassionate goals, and that would lead to a change in their own identity. But then what happens if people change in the sense of identity, but not in the other levels of personality? So you can imagine someone, you know, as a way of coping with adversity, coming up with a sense of their identity that involves them overcoming this adversity. That is helpful because it helps them create a sense of coherence and meaning around their lives. But what happens when that sense of coherence and meaning doesn't jive with the other levels of personality, right? So I think there's something interesting here for personality theories to reckon with. So this is a way in which I think studying post-traumatic growth can sort of lead to, you know, improve into like the development of personality more broadly. As I mentioned, we need more varied assessments. We need better quality studies. You would note that most of my research examines change over a short period of time, around 1 year, 1.5 years maximum. It's practically hard to do multi-year studies, and I'm happy to talk about some of the challenges of doing them in the Q&A. We need to move beyond thinking about this simplistic idea of growth and redemption more broadly, and think more in terms of, okay, if people can change for the better, on what domains do they change, right? So I'm working with the philosopher Michael Brady and trying to figure out, okay, what are these domains that we feel confident would change, right, in the wake of adversity? And similar to that, I think we need to question the term growth, right? Because the term growth, assumes that we're somehow better off overall, right? We're somehow a better person overall. Whereas I think even most post-traumatic growth researchers acknowledge that, well, people are going to change in positive ways, but they're also going to change in negative ways, right? And we need to acknowledge that complexity. So yes, going through adversity might mean that I become wiser, more compassionate, but it also means I might mean I have a worse relationship with my wife and family, right? I think a perverse outcome of saying that, oh, growth can occur through trauma is that you might have to acknowledge that, well, if you can grow in this really important way, maybe everyone should be made to go through that trauma, right? Since clearly you grew and you become a better person. I should also note that, you know, a lot of research has focused on domains of growth that have been sort of developed through interviews with US participants. So the post-traumatic growth inventory was developed using, I think, insights from US Army veterans. We need more cross-cultural research about the domains in which people might experience positive change. We've done some work on this in Sri Lanka and Rwanda. We have some work in Rwanda suggesting that when people talk about domains of growth, they tend to focus on non-psychological domains. They tend to talk about opportunities for education, or opportunities for employment. And psychological domains tend to come relatively down the list, right? So I think we need more cross-cultural research. Some broader considerations, we need to move beyond a single trauma framework. Most of you who do clinical research know that this idea that people just go to one event that then changes them, it's a very culture-specific understanding of what it means to go through trauma. Many of my participants in my studies have gone through multiple events. We need to have a better understanding about the characteristics of events that lead to change, right? There's some interesting work in personality that's trying to look at these characteristics. And also we need to look at idiographic trajectories, right? So I mentioned on average in my sort of intensive longitudinal study, we didn't see evidence for change. We're currently looking at the data to examine whether there are idiographic trajectories that are consistent with change for adversity. And maybe down the line try and identify, okay, what is distinctive about those people compared to other people? So I'm going to end by simply saying that this is really important but challenging work. I think it's challenging because we're scientists, but we're also humans. This is a picture of me with my former postdoc interviewing survivors of the Sri Lankan Civil War, like around 10 years ago. That day we interviewed 5 people, and I should say that the 2 stories that stood out for me out of those 5 people were people who were talking about their resilience, the fact they've gone through these horrible things, but that's come out strong, and me think, oh wow, this is so like inspiring, right? But I also remember the other 3 stories, which were stories of people who were deeply struggling, right? People who lost their children, who couldn't find them, right? And I think it's worth keeping in mind from a meta-science perspective that we have to figure out a way of doing rigorous research that acknowledges that we might have intuitions, right, that strongly push for belief in this construct, and they may be mindful of those biases and intuitions. And at the same time, when people tell us that maybe they have grown up being real, we need to figure out a way to understand and sort of investigate these reports while not disrespecting them, right? Not saying, well, what you may have this story, but it's not true, Because it's equally true that if people have this belief that they have to grow upon adversity, you might end up in a situation where you blame the victim, right? Because the person who's gone through adversity not only has the responsibility of going through the adverse event and managing its negative impact, but somehow growing and finding lessons as a result. So I am sorry, I know I've only left a few minutes for questions. I want to thank my many collaborators, in particular my postdocs, Laura Blackie, Kelly Brenner, and Megan Gangle, who worked on many of these studies. This is a talk I developed in the last couple of weeks, in part because I had the opportunity to present at University of Toronto last week and this week. And my 3-year-old son, Micah, who's on the left, was very keen on being involved in these talks. He said if he could come for the talk today, he would happily press all the buttons. I had to break it to him that my work is not that exciting, but he wanted to say that he was willing to take part. I want to thank you all for your time, and I am available for questions.
Thank you, Eranda. We do have time for questions. I will just remind folks, if you do have a question, you can just put it in the chat, or if you would like to raise your virtual hand and I'll call on you. I'll take this opportunity as host to ask a couple of questions, if I may. So I'm very curious about your distinction between perceived growth and I think what you call measured growth.
Yeah.
And I'm convinced that the perceived growth literature, as you point out, has some problems. It seems to me that there are also, and I think you do touch on this, issues to do with measured growth, issues to do with distinguishing it from, as you say, normative growth, which requires, I assume, that one be thoughtful about assessing people who have not gone through the trauma, the event in question, and design issues to do with actually measuring change prior to and following a focal event. But it seems that even if those issues are dealt with, what does it mean to grow, I guess? I mean, there's an assumption, I guess, that growth in terms of this narrative, redemptive narrative that you talked about earlier is somehow perhaps linear. I guess I'm just wondering, when we're talking about this idea of measured growth, what does that mean? Like, are we thinking of it sort of just linearly, or is there reason to believe that measured growth may take on a kind of nonlinear form? And are there efforts to actually do this? That is to see whether, again, kind of keeping all of these design issues in mind, whether measured growth actually does predict health and well-being. I don't know if you can kind of comment on that.
So those are great questions, and I have a couple of responses. Hopefully, I'll be able to. I think there are a lot of very important points there, so hopefully I'll be able to get to most of them. So, again, one of the big challenges with a lot of this research is most of the studies that have explicitly looked at post-traumatic growth have looked at it over a very short period of time, right? So my studies are 1 year, 1.5 years. Now, we wrote this sort of consensus paper around 1.5 years ago. That's 25 different authors. It's a great paper, especially sections I didn't write. And we talk about like recommendations for future research, right? And one possibility is that we can use panel data, right? To be in the US, there's MIDAS in the US, but also in Europe, in Australia, and Britain, right? There's a lot of panel data that could be useful, right? And there are multiple researchers who have done some research looking at life events and personality change and well-being change. Now, one of the challenges is that those studies aren't designed with questions relevant to post-traumatic growth in mind, right? So, for example, you might have a checklist of life events, but you don't have information about how impactful that life event was on the given person. I think another issue, and this maybe speaks to another one of your points, is that many of our measures, especially personality measures, are designed in a way to highlight stability, right? So you're asked, like, in general, do you see yourself as a trusting person? Or in general, do you see the world as full of opportunities, right? And it might be that even if people do experience meaningful change in their day-to-day behaviors, it might take time for them to update their self-construct, right? Their self-control of their own personality, which means you might not see change immediately in these measures, right? So I think another issue is, but if you're interested in looking at change, we need to design measures that are sensitive to change. Now, I can think of at least one study where measured growth, right, which I acknowledge is kind of a relatively crude term, right? But I will say myself, some of my friends and colleagues like Pat Fraser and Howard Tennant, we have these conversations about what do we call it, right? We don't want to say it's real, because we know that there are problems with sort of longitudinous change as well. But we want to make a distinction between like what we think is the right way to do it and what we think is not the right way to do it. But in the Fraser study, right, in Pat Fraser's Psych Science paper in 2009, right, which I think was the first paper to directly address this question of like, do these perceived reports actually measure actual change? She did find that people who reported actual change, which is like a certain, maybe 20% of the sample, reporting actual change was associated with better mental health outcomes, right? Now, it's just one study. That study was a very short-term longitudinal study. I think it might have just been 3 months, right? So, we should like take that study with a grain of salt. But I think, one reason why I think it'd be good to do this type of research, right? It's why it's important is to see, but okay, if people do experience change, is it then associated with mental health benefits, right? Now, I should have mentioned, I think it was either Brent Roberts or someone else who mentioned this at a conference once. You can imagine someone changing on a personality trait that is meaningfully important. So a good example would be creativity, right? Because this is like this belief about how creative people are people who struggle with adversity and trauma. Like Frida Kahlo is a good example of someone who sort of created great art in the midst of all these challenges. So you can imagine like you could find that maybe people do change on certain personality characteristics and they change positively, but that is not reflected in any improvement in their mental health, right? And this is one point we make in this paper I'm writing with Michael Brady, right, who's a philosopher, because I think he's fine with the idea that, look, you can change an important character trait, an important traits or virtues that could be associated with better mental health, it could not, right? Whereas as a psychologist, I'm like, well, that has implications for whether this is something, whether it's a good thing to happen, right? But I think there's something interesting in that, right? Because I think it is quite possible that maybe people might experience changes that are clearly positive, that clearly you can make a reasonable case came from the trauma, but still struggle.
Yeah, that just raises another question about the point about misalignment and whether there are studies that combine or not combine, but assess both of these things, perceived and actual change, and think about it in a kind of profile way, right? So you can imagine some people are saying, yes, I believe I have changed, but they actually are not changing, in terms of their measured growth. Yeah. And how do they fare versus, other profiles of people who vary along these two dimensions. Just one more question, if I may.
You have one in the chat, by the way.
Yes, I'll get to the chat. So I see a couple of threads, Eranda, with your work and some related work, and I'm wondering if I could just pull on them and get your reactions. One is the work around mindsets and mindsets around adversity. And people's beliefs around adversity. So, you might be a person who, views adversity as a debilitating sort of condition, or you might be someone who views adversity as, an opportunity for growth, if you will. The other literature is the literature on stress inoculation, or what developmental psychologist Michael Rutter calls stealing effects. The idea here being that it's not so much, whether adversity is good or bad for you, but how much adversity you are exposed to. And the sort of theoretical intuition here is that there's a kind of Goldilocks zone of stressor exposure that might be health promoting. So I'm just wondering, whether you see connections with this work and how does this all fit in with growth?
So this was both very interesting what I'll call literature. I'll start with the second one first. So, Mark Theory, right, had this really interesting JPSC paper back in 2011, right, where he argued that there's a certain level of like cumulative lifetime adversity, which was like some degree below the average, right, that was associated with these adaptive outcomes in terms of, functioning and life satisfaction and symptoms of depression or trauma. I forget if it's PSS or depression, but one of the arguments he makes is that this pushes back against a theoretical assumption in post-traumatic growth research that the trauma has to be strong enough to shatter your assumptions about the world, right? So this is, I think, one of the reasons why we need better theory on post-traumatic growth is that current theory really draws in these old like psychodynamic ideas about like something has to like completely knock down your worldview and you have to build it back up. Whereas I think empirically, what seems to be a much most reasonable explanation for why some people grow is that there is something about some level of adversity that serves the learning function, right? So they learn coping skills and then they adapt better. And I do think, right, that there is, to the extent to which that literature can inform new work on post-traumatic growth rather than us rely on these sort of like traditional theories, I think that's a good thing. Regarding the growth mindset around adversity, I mean, I think that's interesting. I think one of Angela Duckworth's students, Lauren, is Chris. Oh, I'm blanking on her last name.
Crum, I believe.
I'm sorry?
I think her name is Crum, C-R-U-M.
So Alia Crum has done work on this. And I know when I was in grad school, there was a student of Angela's who's doing work on this, but you're right, this idea that having like it's this sort of growth mindset around adversity and chance. So I think that's really interesting. I will say it'd be interesting to see the distinction between the effects of having that mindset and managing adversity that you're sort of selected into. Like, I'm going to aim for this really important job, or I'm going to join the army and like, you know, become a cadet, right? Versus events that you don't necessarily choose, right? Or events you have no control over, right? I think it'd be interesting to see the impact of having that type of mindset for different types. For life events have different characteristics. I think that would be very interesting in our research.
Great, thank you. Let me get to some of the questions in the chat. There's a question from Celine who asks,
hello, Celine.
Regarding the findings on the continuity of daily positive and affective states following negative events. She's wondering what role depression plays in these emotional states following events.
What role depression plays? So we didn't look at depression as like dispositional. I guess we could have looked at, given the data we collected, we could have looked at dispositional neuroticism. We actually we collected depression measure, right? So we did not look at depression in these analyses, right? You know, I would, my prediction, actually, I take that back. We did look at this. I think higher levels, so what I can tell you is that higher levels of depression did predict greater experiences in negative life events, which is, if you think about it, not like that's consistent with past research.
Great. James, you're on the Zoom call here. Do you want to just
let's go to Ria. Had a great question.
Okay, I'm sorry.
They're still here. Yeah, I can.
I'll ask Ria's question. So when we get an injury or illness, acting faster usually heals better. Does early intervention matter in adversity, and does it reduce sensitivity to future adversity?
So I think the question is what type of intervention, right? So I think one thing that, so, you know, I also do some work on like, you know, sort of global mental health, focus on Sri Lanka, to some extent Rwanda, right? And one like lesson from that literature, right, is that, you know, immediate, what I think it's called psychological first aid. So sort of immediate engagement in the wake of adversity can have a backfire effect. In part because, you know, for many people, there's this sort of normative natural coping response that kicks in, and that by intervening too quickly, you can short circuit that, right? And I think that, you know, thinking about, so I've done some work on post-traumatic growth interventions, right? And this is work where people who are interested in that type of intervention select in, right? But I think even for those types of intervention, one big issue is intervening too early, right? Because you run the risk of blaming the victim, right? Because then you're saying, oh, you know, I know you're still struggling, but let's also look on the bright side, right? So you don't want to run the risk of pushing that message too quickly. And also, you know, I think there's also a similar concern of interfering with someone's normative trajectory of coping, right? Or interfering with like this natural progression of sadness or grief in the wake of intervention, right? So I think that's interesting. I mean, this has been debated, and you know, there's a Twitter version of the debate that's super simplistic, right? But this question of like, how can you intervene in a way that's helpful without like assuming that most people don't have the skills and abilities themselves to deal with it, at least in the short term, right? I think that's a tricky discussion. I mean, I'm not a clinician. I collaborate with clinicians in this work, but they also like, this is something they're constantly wrestling with, right? About what the right point to intervene is and what to intervene with, right? What tools do you introduce first?
Thank you. Jamie, you want to ask your question?
Sure. Yeah, I think this is, by the way, it's fascinating talk. We have some messages in the chat saying, thank the speaker. This was really fascinating. I have a lot of thoughts that, and I'll just make two brief comments that you don't need to respond to immediately, but and then I do a specific question. One is about this karma as a narrative, this idea that if a bad thing happens to you, or if bad thing happens, then something good should come along. Like when one door closes, another opens. And I'm wondering if that's like I didn't see it in the list of kind of the redemption narratives, but it seems like an interesting one that has certainly been co-opted away from its cultural origin, but just as an interesting. The other thing I think is really interesting is this need to adapt and survive from challenges. Like my son in daycare, the first time they had a fire alarm, which horrified him. He was so scared of the fire alarm. They're served bagels. And so sometimes they announce the menu ahead of time. And so like, weeks, months later, we'll say, oh, guess what, Miles, they're serving bagels at school. And he's like, I don't want to go to school.
Oh, dear.
Like he learned instantly, that bagels and fire alarms go together. And like, if you're serving bagels, like, is there going to be a fire alarm? And so we have this need to like develop protection against adversity. I'm wondering if that's a natural, when you talk about this normative process, that you could assume there should be some potential for growth. And again, I'm using the word growth now with quotations in my head, given your talk. So my final actual question, I guess, is, do you think demonstrable personality change can happen from self-discovery, and that adversity can increase self-discovery or self-understanding more so than maybe other life events? And so there could be that mechanism by which personality could change as a result of adversity.
So I'll answer your second question first, right? So one of the points that, so as I mentioned, right, Michael Brady has this very strong provocative take that there may be certain virtues where you necessarily have to go through adversity to sort of develop on. And I think it's interesting, right? So a good example would be the virtue of courage, right? So at the very least, you can't know whether you're courageous until you're in adversity, right? Like you don't know what your trait level is in courage until you've gone through that, right? So from that perspective, I think you're right that there's certain capacities that we have no need to manifest until we've gone through adversity, right? So from the perspective of increased self-knowledge, I think that this seems like obviously true, right? That there's certain aspects of our personality that we're not going to recognize until we've gone through that event, right? Now, I don't know whether that's growth or not, because it's almost like it feels like a revelation of your state of your trait level rather than a growth, right? But I do think that's true. Now, with regards, so one point that researchers have done work on, like the hero's journey on redemption narratives, they always argue that we need to figure out what the main narratives are in different cultures, right? So, for example, in some work that my former postdoc did, Laura Blackie, she found that at least in the UK, there seemed to be more of a recovery narrative rather than a redemption narrative, right? So it wasn't like, oh, good things can happen because of this. It's more like we can get back to where we were, right? And similarly, I think it's important to think about what narratives and what, like, there might be narratives that are very similar to the redemption narrative, that are present in other cultures, but in important ways they might be different. So taking the idea of karma, right? So in Sri Lanka, I can tell you, right, and I remember talking to my grandmother about various things, right? And I always thought, she had a very sort of, I guess the best way to describe it was cold, right? Like a very cold way of thinking about other people's challenges and troubles was, for her, it's all about karma, right? If something bad happened to you, it's because you did something bad in your past life. And the flip side, I guess, was if you do good things now, maybe you'll have a better life afterwards, right? But for the most part, right, for when she would talk about karma, it was mostly to provide a justification that we don't have to feel bad about someone, because that person had it coming. And I think, for example, right, I'd be really interested to think about what the main narrative, master narrative around adversity is in Sri Lanka, because especially in Sinhalese Buddhist communities, I would not be surprised if many people have this somewhat negative karma narrative, right? It's like, oh, if something bad happens, what's to be done, right? It's because of something you did in your past life, right? So I think, I didn't mention karma, and I think part of it was that I think it takes different shapes and form, right? So you can imagine in the US, when people talk about karma, it's like, oh, something good happened to you now because of something you did earlier in life. Whereas I think in Sri Lanka, it's very much like with karma has got nothing to do with what you're doing now, right? Karma is a result of something you did in the past.
Thank you, Eranda.
Thank you.
I feel I have to circle back to Kelly Clarkson with one last question, which is that, I'm convinced you don't really have anything against Kelly Clarkson per se, but perhaps, or I should say, your critique is not limited to Kelly Clarkson, and maybe it extends to all of America here, which is that given what you just said, I wonder, if this narrative around adversity-related growth is a uniquely Western one, one that sort of emphasizes individualism amid adversity, right? The notion of pulling yourself up from your bootstraps. So, Eranda, what do you have against America?
Oh, I love America, right? That's the right answer. Right? America's the best. It's interesting, right? So in my graduate post-secondary class last year, right, we had a week on post-traumatic growth because I get to design the syllabus. So, but I was asking about cultural variations, and two of my Chinese students said, no, in China, we do have this idea of growth through adversity, but it's at the national level. We talk about adversity, but we talk about adversity in terms of how you can make China strong, how it can make this country strong. And it's, when I was doing research in Rwanda, right, like I think the last time I was in Rwanda was in 2015. And, there are so many sort of billboards, right, with the message of rising from the ashes of the genocide, becoming stronger. So the government has a very strong commitment to this idea that we're going to be stronger than ever at the national level. It's very interesting, right? Because when you talk to people about their lives, they have a much more ambivalent understanding of how they're going to grow as individuals. But there's also this massive narrative about how it's going to be good for the country.
Very interesting. Well, we're at time here, so I want to thank the speaker Eranda for joining us today and sharing with us his really fascinating research around growth. Thank you, Eranda. I really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you for the invitation. Thanks to all of you who came, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.